So, welcome everyone. My name's Sarah Woods. I'm the BSBI's fundraising and engagement manager. I've been looking after this series of winter talks this year, and I'm delighted to say that we've got Rebecca Cornwell this evening, who is a PhD researcher for the University of the Highlands and Islands. She's got an interest in the ecological legacy of Shetland botanical writing, but also in the experience of rare plants in the face of climate change. And she was actually in touch with us earlier this year after some research we published to offer the tonight's talk, which I'm very much looking forward to, around historical records and shifting baseline syndrome, something that is front of mind, I think, for all of us when we're working at BSBI or reviewing historical records, looking at change over time in terms of our plant distribution and our records of that. So without much further ado, just to reiterate again, if you have any questions that come up, we will be coming to those at the end. Do use the Q&A function to put those down during the talk. But otherwise, I will hand over to Rebecca.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this evening to hear me talk about my research. I hope that there is a variety of things in here that will interest a variety of people in the audience, whether you've come in a sort of out of historical interest, out of ecological interest, or out of botanical interest. So I'm going to talk about historical records and shifting baseline syndrome. I'm a PhD student at the University of the Highlands and Islands. More specifically, I'm based in the Institute for Northern Studies and the Centre for Mountain Studies. My PhD is in partnership with the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and I'm funded by the Scottish Graduate School for the Arts and Humanities. And it's thanks to that funding that I've had some really excellent trips to Shetland and to other archives, and I'm going to be drawing on that today in my talk. So we're starting at Bobby's bus stop in Unst. And for anybody unfamiliar with Bobby's bus stop, Bobby is one of my esteemed colleagues in Perth. It's probably the best bus stop in the world. And it's up in Unst, which is the most northerly of the Shetland Islands. And this was the first time I went up to be in Unst, and it was a wildflower theme. And probably this is where my PhD started, but just a long time prior to October 2023. So my project is looking at the ecological legacy of Shetland botanical writing, and I'll explain a bit about what I mean by botanical writing later on. But the aims essentially are to develop a new approach to overcoming shifting baseline syndrome, and as a result of my research, hopefully to inform stewardship of rare plants for future generations. And what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to introduce shifting baseline syndrome as a concept, talk about the importance of historical records, and talk about Shetland, which is the area that I'm using as a case study, talk about two early manuscripts that are changing what we know about the flora in Shetland. They predate the current most well-known flora by Thomas Edmonston, and then give you some examples of working with historical records. And I've got some for you to try your hand with towards the end of the talk. So moving on. So shifting baseline syndrome, it's a concept that originated in fisheries science. And if you look at the graphic here, I'll talk you through it. So a researcher called Daniel Poley basically pointed out that each generation of fisheries scientists accept as baseline the stock size and species basically that they see at the beginning of their career, and then they evaluate all the subsequent change against that. So when the next generation comes along and starts their career, the stocks have declined. As you can see in the diagram, we've got a steady and slightly worrying decline in abundance. So the stocks have declined, but the new generation is starting thinking this is the baseline as it is. And then the next generation comes along and goes, oh, this is the baseline. So you've got change over time, but you've got change that's not being observed over time. And some other researchers put side by side some pictures of variation in fish catch in a particular area over time. And if you look at the photographs, you can see there's a marked difference in the catch from the start, from the early photos to the later photos. So Pauli said that you've got a gradual shift of the baseline, and that's what we mean by shifting baseline syndrome. And the implications of this, you've got basically a gradual change in the accepted norms for the condition of the natural environment. So what we accept as normal for the environment around us, due to factors such as lack of experience, lack of memory, or lack of knowledge of past conditions. And as a consequence, and this was something picked up in the State of Nature report in 2023, you've basically got how each new generation views the world in which it grew up as the reference for how things should look, rather than, really importantly, recognizing that biodiversity is already depleted. And you might ask, why apply a fisheries concept to plants? Well, shifting baseline syndrome has been picked up much more widely now. Started off in fisheries, but it's been applied globally to all sorts of different ecological contexts. And actually beyond that, it's been applied to other non-scientific contexts as well. Another way of thinking about it is much more in terms of perception of change and passing on of knowledge and memories through time. So it crosses over from science into social sciences, into the arts and humanities. But why plants? I'm probably speaking to many people who would be saying, well, obviously, well, why plants? Of course, why not plants? Life as we know it depends on plants. We can't live without them. They're part of our lives. And if you just have a little minute and look at the photo taken in North Row Community Garden in the North Mainland in Shetland, you can just see some examples of why plants are so essential, beyond that we need them for breathing. But they're used as building materials, they're used for food. There's so many uses. So it's really important that we think about shifting baseline syndrome in relation to botany and to plants. So, which brings me on to what is a historical plant record, which is actually a much more difficult question to answer than you might think. So, at the start of my PhD, I spent some time reading the academic literature, looking at journal articles, looking at websites, looking at publications to see if there, what is the definition of a historical plant record. And as a result of that, I can report that there's no consensus on what constitutes a historical plant record, nor who gets to define this. And historical can also cover variations such as early records, old records, past records, but without these statements necessarily being qualified any further. But if we think what the actual plant records we have are, they come from fields such as paleo-ethnobotanical, which is a branch of environmental archaeology that looks at the relationship between people and plants through plant remains, or archaeobotanical analysis, again, archaeological analysis of botanical specimens. And these tend to be things like seeds, pieces of wood, or it might be pollen analysis. But it's not what we might mean in terms of a written record, a deliberate written record, or a purposely collected plant specimen. And it's the written records that I'm going to concentrate on today. So, in order to progress my research, I had to have some sort of working definition. And in order to go into this with a kind of like all encompassing intention, my working definition for a historical plant record has been what has been written down in the past about plants. But as one of my interviewees helpfully pointed out to me, it does lead to somewhat of an existential crisis, because by the time I finished my research, some of the things which are currently considered as rare won't be, and some of the things that aren't even here will be and will be rare. So we have to be aware that things that we are talking about as current plant records will very quickly become historical records. So it's historical is not a static term. And why are they important? So returning to the idea of shifting baseline syndrome. So you've got a decline in the state of the natural environment. And some of the causes of shifting baseline syndrome are things like lack of data about the environment, loss of interaction with the environment. So that can be things like just not being outside as much, basically, or there's people talk about extinction of experience with the natural world, where we're losing connection with it. And also loss of familiarity. So can you name things? If you can name things, you can talk about them, you can report them, you can pass things on to other people. So you've got causes of shifting baseline syndrome. And then as a consequence, it means that we're getting, as a society, increasingly more tolerant of progressive environmental change, negative change, degradation. There's changes to our expectations about what is desirable. And thinking back in terms of the fisheries management, if each new generation comes in and is taking what they see as their baseline, you've got risks of establishing inappropriate baselines, not willfully, but as a consequence of all this. So inappropriate baselines, which means possibly, well, it makes it a lot harder to set targets for conservation, restoration, management of the environment if you're not dealing with a full picture there. And this leads to a feedback loop, which exacerbates the problem. So why are historical records important? They directly come in here and target the causes of shifting baseline syndrome. So historical records, one of the most important things they do is they give you more data. They can give you more knowledge about past environments. They can give you more understanding of human-plant relationships. And they are a way of caring both for the past and also for the environment through care for the records of the past. So Pauli, who was the fishery scientist who came up with the term shifting baseline syndrome, he called for wider forms of evidence, including anecdotal evidence, to overcome shifting baseline syndrome. And at first kind of glance, whatever, you might think this anecdotal evidence is not particularly scientific sounding. But then if you take a step back and look at it more broadly, anecdotal evidence, we do use anecdotal evidence quite a lot of the time. certainly, if you are, for example, in medicine, a doctor taking a patient history is basically gathering anecdotal evidence. So it doesn't run counter to science necessarily. And I took a screenshot of the Royal Collection Trust website. So Europe's first major international scientific expedition had a botanist, and they went off to South America. And the scientific report included forms of evidence that we wouldn't necessarily take as typical scientific evidence. So oral text, written text, lost text, secret text, text abridged, appropriated, translated, anthologized, plagiarized, letters, reports, survival tales, civic descriptions, navigational narrative, possibly my favorite, monsters and marvels, medicinal treatises, academic polemics, old myths replayed and reversed. So we are used to using wider forms of evidence. I think maybe we need to just learn, so speaking generally here, to try and think how can we positively think about things instead of an instant reaction being, but it doesn't have this detail, it doesn't have that detail. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to from the time it was written. So think like, and instead of but, and what can we do with it? Not, but we can't do something with it. So, having researched the literature for definitions of historical record, amongst other things, I went off to Shetland. I've visited several times, well, many times before I started my PhD, and several times since then. And I went up on my first trip as a researcher to talk to people, find out about records. I also travelled around various locations. I went to the archives, local heritage centres. I did some drop-ins at Shetland Library and various community libraries, and took lots and lots of photographs. So these are some of my photographs here. You can see the rare oyster plant in the middle there, and looked at things like new woodland being planted on Bresser. So I'm going to tell you just some key facts about Shetland if you're not familiar with it. So far from like the assumption that it's a pristine, untouched habitat, there's been human influence in Shetland since the Neolithic settlers. There's over 100 plus islands, 15 inhabited, mainly connected by inter-island ferries, but you do have flights to Fair Island, Fula. Total land area of nearly 1,500 square kilometres, very extensive coastline, nearly 3,500 crofts, and plants are growing in the environment. So plants are growing where they will be affected by human activity. Key economic sectors include fisheries, aquaculture, agriculture, the oil and gas industry, and tourism. And new sectors, clean energy, decommissioning, the film industry, and space. So there's a spaceport in Unst, for example. And thinking about the environment, so it has UNESCO geopark status, and then there is lots of different statutory conservation measures in place. So you've got Ramsar sites, national scenic areas, 2 national nature reserves, Nature Scott Nature Reserve, 78 sites of special scientific interest, and nearly 50 local nature conservation sites, according to the Shetland Islands statistics of 2024. And from a botanical point of view, it's Vice County 112. And it's the whole geographic area of Shetland makes up that botanical recording area. And the County Rare Plant Register has got 138 plant taxa on it. So I want to give you a bit of context about Shetland botany, and two really, really important people who dedicated, pretty much a lifetime's work to Shetland botany, although they weren't botanists themselves, were Walter Scott and Richard Palmer. So Walter Scott is synonymous with Shetland botany. When I asked for who is important in Shetland botany, even though Walter Scott is no longer with us, I got lots and lots of emails saying Walter Scott or simply Walter. And he collaborated for a long time with Richard Palmer, who worked, I think, for the Oxford English Dictionary. And between them, they've produced really significant publications. So the Flowering Plants and Ferns of the Shetland Island is the county flora. That was written in 1987, and it contains a huge amount of very detailed information, records, including anecdotal evidence that Scott and Palmer have assessed and included in their publication. The Rare Plants of Shetland book is essentially the County Rare Plant Register that came out in 2002. And then Walter Scott produced a further publication in 2011. So this updated and corrected some of the records in the 1987 flora, and included a new checklist of plants for the Shetland Islands and some really beautiful plates with specimens that he's collected, particularly of the hawkweeds. So one of the key rare species in Shetland, and often the starting point for wanting to find out more about Shetland rare plants and Shetland historical records, is Edmondson's chickweed, Cerastium nigrescens, variety nigrescens, as it's currently called. This is a specimen collected by Walter Scott that's in the herbarium in Shetland Archives. And it's named after Thomas Edmondson, who was born in Shetland in 1825. Very promising young naturalist, started work on the first flora of Shetland in 1837. Became professor of botany at what is now Strathclyde University, aged I think about 19, but then only very shortly after publishing his Flora of Shetland in 1845, he was the naturalist aboard the HMS Herald and was accidentally shot and killed off the coast of Ecuador. And I first sort of dipped into the historical records by reading the book Young Shetlander or Shadow of Shetland, which is a book by his mother where she brought together his letters, his correspondence with notable botanists who visited Shetland. It's a wonderful tribute to him. And that's where I got started. Many other people, I think, have started in the same place, getting interested in Edmondson's chickweed. So it grows on the Keen of Hammer up in Unst, and it's an Arctic alpine. And one of the most interesting things about the Keen of Hammer is that you've got Arctic alpines growing pretty much at sea level. So the Keen of Hammer there is the rocky hillside. You can see it contains serpentine debris. It's home to some rare Arctic alpines, including northern rock cress and Norwegian sandwort or Scottish sandwort. But again, it's not what you would imagine as an untouched habitat. It's been subjected, the area, to chromite mining, and there was a Second World War RAF station up at the top. So the little gloved hand in the corner is me. I think that's northern rock cress that I had pointed out to me. So Edmonton's chickweed is endemic to Shetland, nationally rare, internationally rare. This is the entry for it in Edmonton's flora. And you can see straight away that there's a difference in names. And if you were to read the entry in detail, you can see that there's been some discussion about the name. In the end, Edmonton is deferring to somebody's authority. There's much discussion over whether, what species, what level it was at, and it's changed. The naming has changed considerably over time as there's been discussion over its taxonomy. So I asked people, what did historical record mean to them, given that there was no consensus in the literature. And the next couple of slides, this slide and the next slide, is just listing some of the responses that I got. So some of the responses were in terms of whether records had been submitted, confirmed. So, for example, a historical record before folks confirmed things, or maybe it was to do with dates. So some saying I've used historical quite regularly to mean pre-2000, or people talked about how it related to technology. So I'm using historic for anything over like 20 years old. So not ancient records, if that makes sense. Maybe it's just pre-GPS, or maybe pre-camera, I don't know, pre-technology. Or somebody said that would depend on the species. They think if it's gone extinct, then any record is historical. But if you're talking about plants, maybe it's the early botanists, so like Edmonston, or the first listings, first accounts of species in Shetland. Another way that people talked about historical records related to their own experience in their own lifetime. So, for example, I think I've got two mindsets on this. I feel like pre-1950 would be one way I think about it, and then another way would be pre-2000s, which is really just because of the age of the person I was talking to, pre-me. Somebody else talked about maybe pre-1970, pre your own existence. Or, interesting, I'd be thinking pre-Walter Scott if I was talking about historical. Scott and Palmer added so much to our knowledge about botany in Shetland that I'd call it historical before that. Or this kind of almost, picks up on like shifting baseline syndrome. Maybe his history isn't just defined by one's lived experience in terms of what predates it, but also what's changed within it. So, challenges of historical records. If you think about plant records as we expect them to be now, certainly if you want to enter them and submit them to the BSBI, things like that, we've got key details you'd expect, such as what, where, when, and who. Wider context is also important, and so are our assumptions and biases, particularly when it comes to historical records. So challenges you might get with historical records. If you're going considerably back, you will be dealing with pre-Linnaean names. So that's before Linnaeus started the binomial system. As shown by the Edmonton chickweed, you get taxonomic changes. In precise locations, it might be listed next to a village that no longer exists anymore, for example, or a mountain that's changed names. Do we know it's growing in the wild, or could it be a garden escape, a deliberate introduction? Strange goings on, such as Heslop Harrison's planting of plants that were subsequently found in, I think it was rum. So things like that can affect the records. Actually, finding them in the first place can be quite challenging. If you think about Shetland, for example, if you search for Shetland, you also need to search for Zetland, Outland, variations on that. Damaged records, I'll show you some of those later. Transcriber errors, modern and old. Certainly when I show you some of the examples, you'll see that it can be really quite challenging to work out what some of the words are. Handwriting can be difficult to read. Language. Early records might be written in Latin. In Shetland, you might get records in Norn. You might be looking at words in Scots, words in Gaelic. So certainly, even when Latin was no longer like in everyday use, it was still everyday use into the not as in people speaking it, but once even when other texts were appearing in English, it could still be quite standard for a formal botanical text to be written in Latin. And all this leads to problems with verification and validation. So I'm going to talk about two manuscripts in particular that are changing what we know about first and earlier evidence for many Shetland species. So these predate Edmonstons's 1845 flora. This doesn't mean that his flora is any less important. If you think about it, that what we're getting is additional evidence here. And these manuscripts, they also contain data for Orkney and other locations in Scotland. So I kind of had to work out the timeline for this, and Walter Scott had diligently archived his lifetime's work. It's a fantastic collection in the Shetland archives. But you can see how subsequent discovery of historical data can affect what's in existing publications. So Scott and Palmer first became aware of Robertson's list after publishing the county flora, but before the rare plant register. Data on Fothergill seemed to be discovered after the rare plant register, but before the update in 2011. And going back to shifting baseline syndrome, if you think, again, you're thinking about this decrease in biodiversity over time. So the bottom axis of this graph here has got generations of biologists. We'll just think about generations of humans. We won't think specifically about biologists. Just, going from the far past into the far future. So another way of thinking about shifting baseline is in terms of, the loss of memories, the loss of knowledge, going from generation to generation. So I've stuck a smiley face on now, which is where we are. And if you think about in our own lifetime, you've got biographical dimension, as it's called. So that's things we learn and change and pass on within our own lifetime. You've got intergenerational transmission. So that's from the near past and the nearest past. So that can be through maybe new generations. You go back further than that, you're like recovering baselines. You're not having direct transmission of information. That's particularly important when things have been written down. And the aim of all this is to collectively be able to pass this on into the near future and hopefully the far future. So the manuscripts, the Robertson and Fothergill manuscripts I'm talking about, we're talking about recovering information from the far past. This is beyond where you're going to get generational transfer of knowledge. So James Robertson was a gardener at the Royal Botanics in Edinburgh when John Hope was the Regius Keeper. Hope trained him as a botanist. Apparently, Robertson was illiterate when he started working there. He was certainly highly literate by the time he was writing travel journals and botanical floras. So he travelled widely in Scotland between 1767 and 1771. Fothergill was a naturalist from Yorkshire. It seems that his primary interest was ornithology, but he seems to have been a competent naturalist all in all, even if some of his other interests were slightly more dubious and kind of like prompted his later emigration to Canada, where he then became prominent in business and in politics. He travelled to Orkney and Shetland, and his aim was to write a cultural and natural history. So very wide-ranging aims there. So they both travelled during spring and autumn. This is important because it gives us an idea of what they could reasonably expect to see. Robertson travelled in 1769. He was back in Orkney in 1770. Fothergill travelled in 1806. And they travelled extensively through the mainland of Orkney and Shetland and many of the islands. And when thinking about how they travelled, it's important to keep in mind that you didn't have road systems, you didn't have cars. So travel by boat was really important on foot and by pony. You get very different perspective if you're thinking about things from the sea, travel by boat. That's probably explains why they visited quite so many of the islands. So what did they leave? So Robertson's the evidence that survived are travel journals, 4 lists of the flora and fauna, and he was compiling a summary table of the flora and fauna of Orkney, Shetland, Arran, Bute, Mull, Skye, and the Outer Hebrides. And most of his surviving manuscripts have been compiled into this very helpful book by Henderson and Dixon on Robertson. And just to give you an example of, we'll just look at one species, eelgrass, that is rare in Shetland. This is a map from the Plant Atlas 2020 website showing records that are earlier than 2000 are in grey, and then the more modern records are in black. And you can see that there's been significant decline in the distribution of eelgrass and Zostera marina due to dieback. That's a specimen from the Botanics in Edinburgh of eelgrass from Shetland. Robertson was recording eelgrass. If you remember that his main mode of travel will have been by boat, it's probably not surprising that he managed to record it so widely. But also because he did record it so widely, it does, lend credence to it being much more abundant then and much more easy to spot than it would be now. So these are manuscripts held in the Signet Library in Edinburgh. So the one on the left is Robertson's summary table, and you can see Zostera marina there with the one indicating that he saw it in Bute, Arran, Mull, and Skye. The tables for the Long Island, which is the Outer Hebrides, and Orkney and Shetland. They're mapped out in the summary table there, but not filled in by that page. But the individual floras have got information for that. So that's the flora of the Long Island. Then you've got Orkney. I've put little arrows on to indicate where it is, and Shetland. Fothergill left draft and revised travel journals and a partly completed natural history, of which the most complete part is the flora. And he, unlike James Robertson, he left some remarks. So Robertson just left names. Fothergill gave descriptions as well. So he would refer to, for example, the mountains of Hoy. So I'm going to talk through some examples from Fothergill's catalogue and how we might interpret them. So just as Edmondson's chickweed is one of the key rarities in Shetland, Orkney, one of the species that people are keen to see in Orkney is Primula scotica. So is it in Fothergill's descriptive catalogue? Well, transcribing his entry for Primula farinosa, he talks about this beautiful little plant, which is by no means common in the middle or southern parts of England, but it abounds in some of the Orcadian islands and some parts of Shetland. The plains of Sander, in particular, are filled with its beautiful flowers during the height of summer. In Fetla, it's also plentiful, and I observed it near the Yalta dances in Fetla. So this is a picture that I took when I was flying over Sanday. So you can see what he means about the plains of Sander. But it being in Shetland is more problematic. So Scott's comment on that was, he was saying, okay, I think Primula farinosa is Primula scotica, but is this, I've heard it described as the time-honoured problem of mixing up Orkney and Shetland. Certainly there's, I think, one modern record for Primula scotica in Shetland, but it's, I think that was possibly somewhere near Lerwick. I can't remember the circumstances exactly. But Scott seems to think that it was certainly Fothergill's sightings were a mix-up between Orkney and Shetland. But in terms of trying to work out location data, for example, this is where local knowledge is really invaluable. Luckily, Mark Smith in the archives in Shetland was able to helpfully tell me where the Yalta dancers are in Shetland, in Fetla, and also what it means. So it means the place where the fairies dance. So it's nearly time for you to do some looking at the records here. So Fothergill had his travel journals as well as his descriptive catalogue. So I've picked out two examples that we're going to have a look at. So the first is an extract of Fothergill going on a botanical ramble when he was in Flora, which is an island off to the west of Shetland mainland. And you can see from the picture here, which I took a photo back in 2019, and the map, that when Fothergill's talking about a botanical ramble on the hills of Fula, it's quite an energetic ramble he must have been on. So this is the record in his travel journal. And what I'd like you to do is, and hopefully your screens are amenable to this, is just have a little look at it and see if you can pick out where the plant information is. I'll pause briefly for you to have a look at this. It does illustrate some of the problems of working with historical records here. For a start, he's crossed his entry through. You've got bits missing. It's quite difficult to read. The originals of these are held in the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library in Toronto, but they were kind enough to give me digital copies. So what is Fothergill actually recording here? He's saying about the roots of a certain golden flower, the something, and I can't work it out, of Linny, which is fruitful on their mountains and which they call bark, and is said to have very strong and excellent tannin quality. In my botanical rambles on the hills, I frequently found parties of boys digging this root, which they did with a little hooked instrument very dexterously. So, okay, we've got a plant mentioned here. Do we necessarily know what it is? So it's Tormentil, Potentilla erecta, and if you were sort of unfamiliar with this, a couple of ways that you could get started would be golden flower of Linny. Okay, so it was known to Linnaeus. Consult Linnaeus's writings on that. Bark, local name. See if you can ask somebody what that means. And certainly, if you couple of really useful publications that I found. So, Golden Flower, there's two books in particular where flowers are arranged by colour, good starting place. And in David Malcolm's book, it's referred to, Tormentil is referred to as bark. So you can make sort of inroads into things by using some detective skills there. And then another example. So just as the Keen of Hammer is important for Arctic alpines, Ranners Hill in towards the north of Shetland mainland, highest point in Shetland, is also important for Arctic alpines. But that's not what I'm going to ask you to find in the next example. So have a look at this one. This is Fothergill was very keen on using up every spare bit of page that he could do, so he didn't even necessarily write in the same direction on each page. But there is a plant name in here. So what he said was, boy calls out a stick growing and with difficulty climbed to what is really a wonder in Zetland, a fine young mountain ash. And then he proceeds to sort of give us some insight into what he thinks about how land should be used perhaps in Shetland. Talking about, should no doubt covering that side with wood in 10 years. And then he's bemoaning that the landholders of Shetland aren't really, doing much agricultural improvement. And then at the top, the vegetation gradually fades into dreadful sterility. So what he's found there, what he's recording is a rowan. If you cross-reference with his entry in the descriptive catalogue, he's talking about finding a beautiful young specimen of the Sorbus ucuparia on Ranners Hill. So this is where the travel journals, along with the catalogue, can really help us with the what, where, when, who, and the wider context. So, to sum up here, so historical plant records are really important, and I may have gone back further into the far past than some people were expecting here. But yeah, as I sort of pointed out, as was made clear to me by somebody I was interviewing, things very quickly become historical. It may be modern to us today, by yesterday, it's now part of history. So in particular, lack of data is a cause of shifting baseline syndrome. And historical data sources, they're going to improve our accuracy and our understanding of presence and absence of plant taxa and of habitat change. And thinking about care, you're paying attention to people who collected records, people who made observations, people who valued this data is also an act of ethical care. So some points to think about. So, do you view the world in which you grew up as a reference for how things should be? I'm aware that I certainly do. And one of the challenging things to me about trying to find locations in Shetland was I would think, oh, yes, I know where that is. And then I'd think, oh, no, it wasn't. That building wasn't built there. That this, that lots of things. So I really have to kind of stop and challenge my own assumptions there. So be aware of your personal baseline. One thing that could help everybody, and I need to be good at this myself, is when we use the word historical, if we just say what we mean, it would make it a lot easier for everybody. And also not reference things in terms of assuming people know things. So not simply to say Roman or Viking, because not everybody is going to know what is meant by Roman or Viking, for example. Can we improve access to an awareness of historical sources and forms of evidence? Certainly, Walter Scott did an amazing thing in archiving his lifetime's work. I'm sure there is wonderful information out there, but if we don't know about it, we can't use it. And then, so on a personal level, what knowledge and experience can you pass on or possibly preserve for future generations? So the photo there is Hermanus Nature Reserve on a slightly foggy day. And it may seem as if the road ahead is long and foggy and we're worried about getting lost in the mists of time fairly literally here. But if you get to the end of the boardwalk on a sunny day, you get this wonderful view of Muckleflugger up off the top there. So, let's try and sort of think what we can really do positively with these records from the past. So I'd like to thank in particular the archive staff who I've benefited from their expertise so much. So Mark Smith, Brian Smith and Angus Johnson in Shetland, James Hamilton at the Signet Library in Edinburgh, Natalia Ratton and Adam Sapper in Toronto, to Walter Scott, who is no longer with us, but for so carefully archiving his life spent botanizing, and to everybody who I've talked to in my research, and also to my supervisors, so Donna Heddle in the Institute for Northern Studies, Ross Bryce in Mountain Studies, and Aline Finger at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh, and again to SAGSA for my funding. And thank you to the BSBI for giving me this chance to come on and speak about my work. And thank you for coming. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was fantastic. Very, very interesting. We will come to questions in a moment. So if you want to add questions into the Q&A, please continue to do so. I just wanted to reference something, and I'll pop a link to it in the chat that everyone can hopefully see, to the project that the BSBI is working up. That was the reason I think, Rebecca, you were in touch in the first place, is that we have this digitization project coming through. So it's really interesting to finish on that message of finding more of those historical records, digitizing more of them, bringing them into the picture to look at, understanding better where we were and where we're going from here. But I've just wanted to pop that link in there so that people can find out more about that digitization if they are interested. There will be opportunities to volunteer, to digitize records, historical records there. And you're absolutely right. I was thinking as you were speaking, we've meant a lot of different things when we've talked about historical, when we've talked about that project. And some of them are archive handwritten, some of them are simply typed recording cards from the 1960s. So you're absolutely right to put that challenge. We've got a couple of questions coming in, and a couple of people saying thank you very much. That was very interesting. Heather has asked, have you tried using AI to read and translate some of those tricky handwritten texts?
I haven't personally tried it, but I'm aware that AI is used for this sort of thing. I think it's, if my project is, I'm trying to fit an awful lot in 3.5 years, I think, and it's not something I could do myself, but I do know that people do use AI for this, and I think if carefully done, there's probably room for doing that. But I think it could be problematic where you're dealing with, for example, place names and dialect and names for plants that are maybe hardly written in, because AI draws is a large language model, so it's drawing on what is already out there in the internet. So it's not necessarily going to pick up on things that have just not been written about or published on the internet. So it may miss things, and I think there's possibly a danger of it trying to come up with other things that it thinks are helpful, because it's a form of programming.
Hmm.
So anything I think that did was produced through AI would still have to be carefully read in the wider context of, is is this probable? Is, even if it's not necessarily probable, can we can we actually sort of assess how reasonable this is here?
I was wondering, do you have an idea of what your I don't know if favorite is the right word, but what is the best source of these sorts of historical records? Which sources do you prefer working with the most? Is it the journal entries? Is it someone creating lists, or is it all the different places that you find evidence of plants across a culture or a community?
That's a really good question. There's something about the feeling like a proper researcher when you're actually handling a bit of microfilm and looking at the old records. Um, I've looked at lots of different sources. Um, I do enjoy when you've got wider context. Um, I could certainly give you a whole seminar series on Robertson or Fothergill, for example. By the time you've read their travel journals, Fothergill in particular is does not hold back about what's going on. He almost writes too much,
Mhm.
but he writes about quite often on his travels being overcome by fits of melancholy. So you're there kind of going, oh, poor boy as well, because um, so it's really interesting when you've got the wider context there, but them as people, but also them on their travels, who they've met, where they've been. There's so much little bits of information that you can sort of start to pick out from it. Um, if he's describing going from A to B and he sees a particular plant, is it likely from the terrain, the way he's crossed there, that he's actually seen that that species, for example? So I do like the ones with the people attached.
Yes, yeah. Jan's asked a really interesting question. She said, "What are you hoping people will do in a practical sense with the information you're finding out about what has been lost on Shetland, beyond wishing so much hadn't been? Might it be possible there are seeds in the seed bank? Perhaps nature restoration projects might use what you found to inform what they plant and where."
That's a really interesting question. So what I've what I've been finding is that there's a definite mix in what has been recorded. So I certainly couldn't at this stage say I've got a record for something that's been lost.
Mhm.
Maybe given slightly more time to do my data analysis, I might actually identify that. I think it's more in terms of what to do with the actual records, and then maybe somebody else further down the line will be able to like practically implement things. I've transcribed all of Robertson's records. For Shetland. I've transcribed Fothergill's record descriptive catalogue for Orkney and Shetland. I'm hoping to work with the BSBI to get these records mentioned somehow on the database,
Great.
and get the records into the public domain. And then the last part of my research, I really want to find out what people value and think about these records and how they think they could be used. That's how I plan to like finish up my PhD and tie it together. So we've got ideas about how we can use these records to counter shifting baseline syndrome. You know, what's important about them that is worth sharing and highlighting, for example.
That's really great because Jim McIntosh, who's one of who's our previous Scotland officer, VCR, he has just asked as well. He's checked. He said, be great to digitize all of James Robertson's records. Some county recorders have done that for their vice counties, for the Western Isles, West Ross and Buse. But there's only one record in the BSBI database for Shetland, and there are no records for Fothergill in the DDB as far as he can see. And he then asks, would it be feasible to extract Fothergill's records given the difficulty of reading his notes? But that's what you've done.
Yeah, it's well underway. I'm on to the stage of trying to cross-reference dates and locations for as many as I can. It's not going to be a huge names, fine, dates and locations is a lot harder. But I'm persevering with it.
I'm sure there'll be people listening to this who are keen once that data set is available to get their hands on it and see what can be learned from it, as with all the records we're hopefully digitizing. I think we'll just have one more, if that's all right, just to finish. And it was a question around what changes, and this is speaking in the different direction really, but what do you think the next generation will experience because of the number of digital records we have now, where obviously they still have their baseline from their own personal experience, but we hopefully have a much more secure, maybe, historical record, if historical is now, from now looking backwards, for the last period of time when we've got those digitized records?
I'd say that hopefully the next generation is going to be well set up in terms of data. I think there's possibly a danger of too much data and not enough actual experience of what these plants are, where they grow. I think that it's finding some sort of balancing act between great availability of data and going back to things like, but can you actually identify it? Where do you find it? And all the wonderful things that you get from actually experiencing being out there, looking at plants and things like that. I'm not sure if that necessarily answers the question, but I think there's lots of things to be hopeful about in the future, in certain terms of, things like the Plant Atlas is an amazing source of data. We just need to hang on to the human connection with the environment here, because we're part of it.
Fantastic, Rebecca. That was a brilliant talk. Thank you so much. We'll be posting this one up on YouTube, and we have one more winter talk this year coming up in 2 weeks' time, so I hope people can join us for that one as well. But thank you again, and we look forward to getting all these records digitized down the line. If there's anyone who's interested in turning your notes into actual records on the DDB, perhaps they can get in touch with you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.